So the question is, if you could just share a bit about your experience, either from a local, national, whatever perspective you want to speak on, around any or all of the Millennium Development Goals under discussion around gender equality, maternal health, or HIV and AIDS, and just in terms of the current state of affairs, women's experiences, any kind of general comments you want to give to just lay the groundwork.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
Sure.
For those of you who haven't heard of Sister Song, we are a national women of color organization. We're a national women of color, a reproductive health organization that advocates for reproductive justice for communities of color across the country. Our three principles that we operate by are, number one, a woman has the right to have children and to dictate the circumstances under which that child is brought into the world. A woman has the right not to have a child and to access family planning and abortion services as necessary. And then thirdly, a woman has the right to parent the children that she already has with the social supports necessary. And I speak to this as an organizer in the South. I worked many years with the labor union and organized women, particularly around economic justice and reproductive health early on. Because our voices were not listened in certain spaces. But I bring sort of a perspective from the state of Georgia as well as a regional South perspective to this conversation. So last year, Sister Song received a grant from the Urban Institute. And part of what the grant was supposed to do was to give us money to host a regional conference to identify local policies that were successful on the local level, despite the fact that state governments may have been resistant to passing progressive policy, right? So with the help of several partners, Sister Song organized about 25 cities from across the South, as far west as Louisiana, as far north as Tennessee, Arkansas, I don't know how to go north, but Arkansas, West Virginia, it was approximately 16 states. We were particularly interested in finding policies that had worked on the local level, even though they would never have passed on a state level. We were interested in finding policies that were driven by women of color in a local community or were driven by a healthcare disparity that disproportionately impacted women of color on the local level. I don't think many people would be surprised to find out that in the South, healthcare disparities, reproductive health outcomes are bad no matter which state that you are in. When we're talking about how resources federally are distributed, oftentimes the South not only is, I think people think the South, many dollars don't flow into the South, but actually what is happening, especially with you have a conservative leadership in the state, as far as state electeds, oftentimes what happens is state dollars are rejected from coming into the South. So in states like Mississippi, for example, where you have one abortion clinic and one of the highest teen pregnancy rates in the country, or in Alabama, where we have one of the highest rates of incarcerated women in the country. In Georgia, where right now, we're dealing with blowback and controversy around the high number of abortions that take place, but unfortunately, I don't know if even unfortunately is the right word. What happens is Georgia has become the most progressive of all the southern states, when in actuality, the laws in our state are not as progressive as they should be. But when you compare them to a Mississippi or compare them to an Alabama, even in the cases of Louisiana, where environmental oppression has taken place and women of color have been disproportionately affected, we really have to look at the laws and see what strides can be made if the state government is not willing to intervene and protect women. So we were very happy to not only we felt like identifying local models was a good way to figure out a litmus test or some kind of standard for the South. What do people respond to? What do they not respond to? In certain cases, we were able to find good local policies that were able to be translated up to the state level. For example, in North Carolina, which has become sort of the golden child of the South as far as comprehensive sex education, they had sort of the premier example of not a local city, not a county, but one school principal being fed up with watching girls of color come in with and constantly being pregnant. And she recognized that it was about not just about healthcare services, but about the lack of comprehensive sex ed. So that one principal decided to directly send a letter to the parents and say, tell me what you want. Do you want abstinence-only education? Do you want comprehensive sex education? Do you want no education? Do you want to be responsible for sex education? The parents overwhelmingly said, we want you to educate our children, do comprehensive sex ed. The results 10 years later have proved that teen pregnancy rates have gone down. That model was then taken and applied to a district. That model worked. It was then applied to a county. That model worked, and it was recently adopted as state legislation this past year. And so we recognize that there really has to be a different approach than starting from the top down, that there are people doing good work. It starts sort of with these small local municipalities, people who understand that the small enclaves of government, the school board, the Board of Education, city councils, county commissioners, those small districts are where change can really be made. And literally, you know, if a bill is meant to be enacted March 15th, usually people feel the impact March 16th or March 17th or even maybe by the end of the month, whereas with federal policy, something can be enacted and it takes years for you to actually have sort of it empirically manifests itself in your day-to-day life. And so I think once people recognize the power in local government, that's sort of how we can make a change. And I think as it relates to the Millennium Goals, we have made it a priority to start what we're calling, I'm trying to come up with a more savvier name, the Reproductive Justice Southern RJ. It's the Southern RJ Coalition. Yeah, it needs a better title. But at the end of the day, what we recognized was that there are populations of people who recognize that things like infant mortality rates, HIV, AIDS, STI rates, access to abortion, that all of these things can be impacted if local governments are willing to try models out that really work for where they live, the space and time, the city, the county, the state, to make a difference in women's lives. And we can ultimately translate that, but we just have to be willing to take the long view, produce the empirical data, help that, make sure that that's translated to larger bodies, and create history as we make it, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I think that's sort of where we are. We are moving forward, really bringing together the groups of women that we've organized to pull that conference together, to make sure that we have an activist network and people who recognize that policy goes hand in hand with activism. You can't always be inside cutting deals while you're outside raising hell, but the two work very well together if you're strategic and if you, at the end of the day, prioritize mobilizing the base. And so that's where we are, is making sure that our base is identified, that we mobilize them and educate them to be good advocates for themselves.